The Valley of Death, how 12,000 Union soldiers were slaughtered at Cold Harbor in minutes. Picture this. It is 5 o'clock in the morning on June 3rd, 1864. You are a Union soldier crouched in a shallow trench in Virginia. Your hands are shaking as you pin a piece of paper to your uniform jacket. On that paper, you have written your name and your home address. You are not the only one doing this. All around you, thousands of men are doing the exact same thing. They are writing their names on scraps of cloth, on playing cards, on anything they can find. They are pinning these makeshift identification tags to their coats because they know that in a few minutes they are going to charge across an open field toward Confederate entrenchments, and they know they are not coming back. This is not pessimism. This is mathematics. The men around you have seen what happened yesterday when the first units attacked. They watched whole regiments evaporate in less than 10 minutes. They heard the screaming. They saw the bodies piled so thick that the later waves of attackers had to climb over their own dead to reach the enemy lines. Now, it is your turn. In just moments, the order will come. You will stand up. You will climb out of this ditch. And you will walk into what history will remember as one of the most lopsided slaughters of the entire Civil War. This is the Battle of Cold Harbor. In the span of 8 minutes, 12,000 Union soldiers will become casualties. Not wounded. Not captured. Casualties. That means dead or so badly mangled that they will never fight again. 8 minutes. That is less time than it takes to cook breakfast. In those 8 minutes, the Army of the Potomac will suffer losses equal to some entire battles of the Revolutionary War. The ground will become so carpeted with blue uniforms that Confederate soldiers will later say they could have walked 100 yards without ever touching dirt. And when it is finally over, when the smoke clears and the screaming stops, Ulysses S. Grant, the man who ordered this attack, will write in his memoirs that Cold Harbor was the one assault he wished he had never ordered. Coming from a general who had already presided over the bloodbaths of Shiloh, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania, that is saying something. But here is what the history books do not tell you. How did the Union Army, the same army that had just outmaneuvered Robert E. Lee for a month straight, end up walking into a meat grinder? Why did Grant, the master of relentless forward momentum, order an attack that he knew was doomed? And how did the Confederates, an army that was starving and outnumbered, manage to inflict such catastrophic damage in such a short amount of time? The answer lies in a revolution in warfare that was happening in real time. The answer lies in the collision between old tactics and new technology. The answer lies in trenches, rifle muskets, and the industrial efficiency of killing. Before diving into this forgotten story of courage and catastrophe, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of American military history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these stories of American sacrifice together from different parts of the country, connected across time by our shared history and the memory of those who gave everything for the Union. Now, look down at that piece of paper pinned to your chest. The ink is starting to run from your sweat, the drums are starting to beat, and the officers are starting to shout. It is time. The trap is about to spring shut, and you are standing right in the middle of it. To understand why Cold Harbor became such a catastrophe, you have to understand where Grant and Lee were in the larger chess match of the war. By early June of 1864, the two greatest generals in America had been locked in a deadly embrace for over a month. This was not the war of grand maneuvers and clean victories anymore. This was industrial warfare. This was attrition. This was two heavyweight boxers standing toe-to-toe and hammering each other until one of them dropped. It had started in early May with the Battle of the Wilderness, a nightmare of fire and smoke in the tangled Virginia woods where no one could see more than 50 feet. Grant had crossed the Rapidan River with 120,000 men, determined to destroy Lee once and for all. Lee had met him with 65,000 veterans and turned the forest into a hell. 18,000 Union casualties in 2 days. 17,000 Confederates. But here is where Grant was different from every other Union general Lee had faced. When the Wilderness ended, instead of retreating back across the river to lick his wounds like McClellan would have done, or like Hooker would have done, Grant turned south. He kept moving. He kept pushing. The armies collided again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. For 2 weeks, they tore at each other in some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. There was a place called the Bloody Angle, where men fought hand-to-hand for 20 hours straight in the pouring rain. They stabbed each other with bayonets through gaps in the log fortifications. They shot each other in the face at point-blank range. The fighting was so intense that musket balls cut down a tree 2 feet thick just from the sheer volume of lead flying through the air. 18,000 more Union casualties, 12,000 Confederate, but Grant kept moving south. The pattern was clear now. Grant was not trying to beat Lee in a single glorious battle. He was grinding him down. Every time they fought, the Union lost more men than the Confederates. But here is the thing. Grant could afford those losses. The North had 3 times the population of the South. The North had the factories to replace rifles and uniforms and ammunition. The North had the railroads to bring up fresh troops. Lee did not have any of that. Every man Lee lost was irreplaceable. Every bullet fired was one less bullet in the dwindling Confederate stockpiles. Grant understood this brutal mathematics. He was willing to trade 2 Union soldiers for every Confederate because eventually Lee would run out of soldiers first. This was a new kind of war. This was total war, and it required a new kind of general, one who could stomach the casualty lists. Grant was that general, but even Grant had limits. Even he could feel the weight of all those dead men. By the time the armies reached the crossroads near Cold Harbor in late May, the Army of the Potomac had suffered 55,000 casualties in 1 month. That is almost half of what Lee started with. Grant had lost an entire army's worth of men and still had not broken through Lee's lines. Now, here is where the trap begins to form. Cold Harbor was not a town. It was not even really a settlement. It was just a crossroads where a few roads met near the Chickahominy River, about 10 miles northeast of Richmond. The name came from a tavern that used to serve cold meals to travelers, a cold harbor for weary riders. But in early June of 1864, Cold Harbor became the most important piece of real estate in Virginia. Whoever controlled that crossroads controlled the roads to Richmond, and Richmond was the prize. Richmond was the Confederate capital. Richmond was where the Southern war effort lived. If Grant could take Richmond, the war was over. Lee knew this too. He knew that if Grant got between him and Richmond, it was finished. So, when the Union cavalry seized the crossroads on May 31st, Lee reacted instantly. He rushed troops south. He ordered his engineers to start digging. And here is where the revolution in warfare becomes critical. By 1864, both armies had learned a harsh lesson. The rifle musket had changed everything. Think about this for a second. In the Revolutionary War, a soldier carried a smoothbore musket that was accurate to maybe 50 yards on a good day. You had to get close to do damage. Battles were fought at point-blank range. But by the Civil War, every infantryman carried a Springfield or an infield rifle musket. These weapons could kill a man at 500 yards. A trained soldier could fire 3 aimed shots per minute. Massed infantry firing in volleys could put up a wall of lead so thick that charging across open ground became suicide. The generals knew this. They had seen it at Fredericksburg, where waves of Union soldiers were mowed down trying to assault Marye's Heights. They had seen it at Gettysburg, where Pickett's charge turned into a slaughter. They knew that frontal assaults against prepared positions did not work anymore. But knowing something and accepting it are 2 different things. The entire military doctrine of both sides was still based on the Napoleonic Wars, on the idea that massed infantry attacks with bayonets could carry any position if the men had enough courage. The problem was that courage did not stop bullets. So the solution became trenches. If you could not cross open ground without being shot to pieces, you dug a hole and made the enemy come to you. And if they tried to assault your trenches, you killed them from behind cover. This is what Lee's men were doing at Cold Harbor. As soon as they arrived, they started digging, not little foxholes. We are talking about elaborate field fortifications. Trenches 6 feet deep with log parapets on top. Zigzag traverses to protect against enfilade fire. Overhead, cover to stop mortar shells. Interlocking fields of fire so that no attacker could advance without being hit from multiple angles. In just 2 days, the Confederate Army turned the Cold Harbor crossroads into a fortress. Grant arrived on June 1st and immediately saw what he was facing. But he also saw an opportunity. Lee's army was stretched thin. The Confederates were exhausted from a month of constant fighting. Grant had fresh reinforcements arriving, including the 18th Corps from Butler's army, men who had not been chewed up in the wilderness in Spotsylvania. If he could hit Lee hard and fast before the Confederates could consolidate their position, he might be able to break through. He might be able to end the war right here. So Grant ordered an attack for June 2nd. But the army was tired. The men were scattered. Coordination broke down. The attack was postponed to June 3rd. This delay was fatal. It gave Lee's veterans 24 more hours to dig, 24 more hours to cut fields of fire. 24 more hours to register ranges and mark landmarks, so they would know exactly where to aim when the attack came. By the time the sun rose on June 3rd, the Confederate line at Cold Harbor was not just a trench, it was a killing machine. It was a 7-mile-long shooting gallery designed to funnel attackers into pre-sighted lanes where Confederate riflemen could not miss. And Grant was about to send 60,000 men directly into it. The plan was simple, at least on paper. 3 Union Corps would attack simultaneously at dawn. The 2nd Corps under Hancock would hit the Confederate right. The 6th Corps under Wright would smash the center. The 18th Corps under Smith would strike the left. The idea was to overwhelm the defenders with numbers, to hit them so hard in so many places that the line would crack somewhere. It was the same theory behind every major assault of the Civil War. Concentrate your force. Attack with everything you have. Accept the losses. Break through. But there was a problem. The Corps commanders were not confident. They had scouted the Confederate positions. They had seen the trenches, the earthworks, the abatis of sharpened stakes in front of the lines. They knew what was waiting for their men. General Baldy Smith of the 18th Corps tried to tell Grant that a frontal assault would be suicidal. Grant overruled him. General Hancock, the hero of Gettysburg, privately told his staff that he expected to lose half his corps. But orders were orders. Grant wanted an attack. Grant was going to get an attack. The soldiers knew it too. That is why they were writing their names on pieces of paper and pinning them to their uniforms. In the hours before the assault, an eerie quiet fell over the Union lines. Men wrote letters home that they knew would be their last. They gave their personal effects to friends who were not in the first wave. They prayed. Some of them cried. These were not cowards. These were veterans. These were men who had survived the wilderness in Spotsylvania. They knew what combat looked like, and they knew that what they were about to do was different. This was not a battle. This was an execution. At 4:30 in the morning on June 3rd, the Union artillery opened up. For 30 minutes, Federal guns pounded the Confederate lines, trying to suppress the defenders, trying to create gaps in the fortifications. It did not work. The Confederate trenches were too deep. The overhead cover protected them. The shells exploded harmlessly in the dirt or sailed over the trenches into the rear areas. All the barrage accomplished was to wake up every Confederate soldier and let them know the attack was coming. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the bugles sounded. All along the Union line, 60,000 men stood up. They fixed bayonets. They dressed their ranks. And then, in near silence except for the rustling of equipment and the breathing of terrified men, they began to march forward. They climbed out of their own trenches. They formed up in parade ground formations, shoulder to shoulder, line after line. And they started walking toward the Confederate earthworks. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. The Union soldiers walked in silence. Some of them broke into a jog. A few started shouting to keep their courage up. They covered 50 yards, 100 yards. They could see the Confederate earthworks now, just low mounds of dirt with the barrels of rifles poking over the top. Still no firing. Maybe the artillery had worked. Maybe the Confederates had pulled back. Maybe this was not going to be as bad as everyone thought. Then the world exploded. The Confederate line erupted in a single, simultaneous volley. It was not sporadic fire. It was not the gradual buildup of a normal battle. It was every rifle along a 7-mile front firing at the exact same instant. The sound was not like individual gunshots. It was a continuous roar, like thunder that did not stop. And the effect on the advancing Union lines was catastrophic. The rifle muskets of 1864 fired a bullet called a mini ball. It was a conical lead projectile about the size of your thumb. When it hit a human body, it did not make a clean wound like a modern bullet. It tumbled. It deformed. It smashed bones into fragments. It created wounds that almost never healed. A man shot in the arm usually lost the arm. A man shot in the leg usually died from infection within a week. A man shot in the torso died immediately or spent his last hours screaming. Now imagine 12,000 of those bullets hitting 12,000 men in the span of 8 minutes. That is what happened at Cold Harbor. The front rank of the Union advance simply disappeared. 1 second they were men running forward with rifles and bayonets. The next second they were just bodies hitting the ground. The men behind them stumbled over the fallen and kept coming. The Confederates reloaded and fired again. 3 shots per minute, volley after volley. The Union soldiers tried to return fire, but you cannot aim when you are running. You cannot reload when you are being shot at from multiple directions. The attack broke apart into chaos. Some units made it within 50 yards of the Confederate lines. A few brave or suicidal companies made it within 20 yards. One regiment from Massachusetts actually reached the Confederate earthworks and tried to climb over. They were shot point blank by defenders who simply stood up and fired into their faces. The regiment lost 270 men in less than 5 minutes. The survivors fell back into a depression in the ground and spent the rest of the day pinned down, unable to advance and unable to retreat. On the Union right, Hancock's Second Corps ran into a nightmare. The Confederates had positioned artillery to sweep the entire approach. Canister rounds, giant shotgun shells filled with hundreds of metal balls, tore through the advancing formations. Entire companies were obliterated in single shots. The survivors tried to find cover in a ravine, but Confederate sharpshooters had it pre-sighted. Men who jumped into the ravine for protection were shot the moment they stood up to shoot back. The ravine became a grave filled with wounded men who could not escape. In the center, Wright's Sixth Corps made the deepest penetration. They hit a weak point in the Confederate line where 2 brigades did not quite connect. For a brief shining moment, it looked like the attack might actually work. Union soldiers poured into the gap. They captured a line of rifle pits. They could see the main Confederate trench just ahead. This was it. This was the breakthrough. But then the Confederates counterattacked. Reserves came rushing in from both sides. They closed the gap like a bear trap. The Union soldiers who had made it through were surrounded and cut down. The few who surrendered were the lucky ones. The rest died in the crossfire. On the Union left, Smith's 18th Corps did not even make it close. They were attacking across a completely open field with no cover at all. The Confederates opened fire at 400 yards and just kept firing. The 18th Corps took 3,000 casualties before they even got within effective range of their own weapons. Smith ordered his men to fall back. There was no point in sending them forward just to die. Grant had ordered an attack to carry the Confederate position. Smith had attacked. It had not worked. Continuing was not bravery, it was murder. By 6 o'clock in the morning, 1 hour after the attack began, it was over. All 3 Union Corps had been repulsed. The Confederate line had not budged. Not 1 inch of ground had been permanently gained. The earthworks were still in Confederate hands, and 12,000 Union soldiers were casualties, 12,000 men. In 1 hour, let that sink in, the entire Battle of Bunker Hill in the Revolutionary War produced about 1,400 casualties total on both sides. The Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, where Andrew Jackson became a national hero, produced about 2,000 casualties total. Cold Harbor produced 12,000 Union casualties alone in 1/10 of the time. It was not a battle. It was industrial-scale slaughter, and the worst part, the day was just beginning. After the initial assault failed, the Union Corps commanders expected Grant to call off the attack. It had not worked. Everyone could see that. The Confederate position was too strong. The losses were too heavy. Surely Grant would recognize reality and order a halt. But the orders that came down from headquarters were stunning. Attack again. Grant wanted another assault. He wanted the corps commanders to reorganize their men and try again. The corps commanders were horrified. They sent back reports explaining that another attack would produce the same result. They pleaded for different tactics, for time to bring up artillery, for permission to flank the position instead of attacking it head-on. Grant was unmoved. He had committed to breaking through at Cold Harbor. He was not going to back down now. Attack again. But here is where something extraordinary happened, something that almost never occurred in the Civil War. The soldiers refused, not openly, not with mutiny or insubordination. They just did not move. When the orders came down to prepare for another assault, the men looked at each other and silently agreed that they were not going to do it. Officers shouted commands. Sergeants tried to rally the men. Nothing worked. The Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, the finest fighting force the North had, simply sat down and refused to walk back into that meat grinder. This was not cowardice. These men had charged into artillery at Gettysburg. They had fought hand-to-hand in the darkness at the Wilderness. They had proven their courage 100 times over, but they were not going to commit suicide. They were not going to throw their lives away on an impossible attack just because a general far behind the lines ordered it. For perhaps the only time in the war, the common soldiers overruled their commanders through passive resistance. They did not attack. And eventually, mercifully, the orders stopped coming. By mid-morning, an unofficial ceasefire had settled over the battlefield. The shooting tapered off, the smoke began to clear. And that is when the true horror of Cold Harbor revealed itself. The ground between the Union and Confederate lines was carpeted with bodies. Blue uniforms stretched as far as anyone could see. The dead lay in rows, marking the lines where each unit had been hit. The wounded were worse. Thousands of wounded men lay in no man's land under the blazing June sun, crying for water, crying for help, crying for their mothers. And no one could reach them. This is one of the most shameful episodes of the entire Civil War. For 3 days, wounded Union soldiers lay between the lines, dying slowly of thirst and exposure, while both armies refused to arrange a truce. Grant did not want to ask for a ceasefire because it would be an admission that he had lost. Lee did not offer one because, well, Lee was winning. Why should he? So, the wounded men died. Some of them took 3 days to die. They could hear their comrades in the Union trenches just 100 yards away. They could hear voices, see movement, but no one came. Medical parties that tried to rescue the wounded were shot at by Confederate pickets who thought they might be attackers. The groaning and screaming went on day and night until finally, one by one, the voices fell silent. It was not until June 7th, 4 days after the battle, that Grant finally requested a flag of truce to collect the wounded. By then, it was a recovery mission, not a rescue. Of the thousands of men who had been left on that field, only 2 were found alive. 2 men out of thousands. The rest had died of their wounds, or dehydration, or heat stroke, or despair. Their bodies had been baking in the sun for 4 days. The smell was unimaginable. The burial parties had to tie cloths around their faces just to approach the corpses. They worked for days collecting the dead. Many of the bodies could not be identified. They were buried in mass graves, unknown soldiers who had fought and died for the Union and whose names would never be recorded. The casualty figures from Cold Harbor are staggering even by Civil War standards. In the main assault on June 3rd, the Union Army suffered approximately 7,000 casualties. Over the entire 2-week engagement at Cold Harbor, from skirmishes and follow-up attacks, Union losses totaled about 13,000 men. Confederate losses were roughly 2,500. That is a 5-to-1 kill ratio in favor of the Confederates. It is one of the most lopsided casualty ratios of any major engagement in the war. The Confederates had created a perfect killing ground, and Grant had fed his army into it. But here is the question that haunted Grant for the rest of his life. Why did he order that attack? He knew the Confederate position was strong. His own commanders had warned him. The soldiers knew it was hopeless. So why did he do it? The answer is complicated and reveals something important about the nature of command in war. Grant was caught in a trap of his own making. For a month, he had been using a strategy of constant pressure. He had been moving south, forcing Lee to react, never giving the Confederates time to rest or regroup. It had worked. By late May, Grant had Lee backed up against Richmond. He had achieved what no Union general before him had managed. He had forced Lee into a defensive position with his back against his own capital. But now, having committed to that strategy, Grant felt he could not back down. If he stopped attacking, if he gave Lee breathing room, the momentum would shift. The Confederates would regain the initiative. All the blood spent in the wilderness and Spotsylvania would have been wasted. So, Grant kept attacking even when the tactical situation did not support it. He was a prisoner of his own strategic success. There is also the psychological pressure of command. Grant had been brought east specifically to defeat Lee. Lincoln had made him general-in-chief of all Union armies because every other general had failed. The newspapers were watching. The politicians were watching. Grant knew that if he showed any sign of hesitation, any hint of the timidity that had paralyzed McClellan, he would lose his credibility. So, he projected confidence even when he felt doubt. He ordered attacks even when he knew they might fail. He accepted casualty lists that would have broken lesser men. Grant later called Cold Harbor his greatest regret. But in the moment, he felt he had no choice. He had to keep pushing. He had to keep attacking. Otherwise, the Union might lose the will to continue the war. And there is one more factor that we have to acknowledge, as uncomfortable as it is. By June of 1864, Grant had become somewhat numb to casualties. 55,000 men lost in 1 month. After a while, the numbers stop meaning anything. They are just statistics on a page. Grant knew intellectually that each number represented a life, a family back home that would receive a letter, a mother who would never see her son again. But he could not allow himself to dwell on that. If he did, he would not be able to function. So, he compartmentalized. He focused on the strategic picture. He told himself that these losses were necessary to win the war, to end slavery, to preserve the Union. And maybe he was right. But the men at Cold Harbor paid the price for that calculation. After Cold Harbor, Grant never again ordered a frontal assault against entrenched Confederate positions. He had learned his lesson in the most brutal way possible. For the rest of the war, he used maneuver and siege tactics. He would pin Lee down at Petersburg and slowly strangle the Confederate supply lines until the Army of Northern Virginia starved. It worked, but it took 10 more months and thousands more casualties. Cold Harbor taught Grant that there are limits to what courage can achieve. There are some positions that simply cannot be carried by direct assault. The rifle in the trench had changed warfare forever. The generals of the Civil War were learning this lesson in blood. For the Confederate soldiers who defended Cold Harbor, the victory was bittersweet. Yes, they had inflicted catastrophic losses on the Union Army. Yes, they had held their ground against overwhelming numbers. But they were still trapped. Lee knew that winning defensive battles was not enough. He needed to maneuver, to take the fight to Grant, to do something unexpected. But he did not have the men or the supplies for offensive operations anymore. All he could do was dig deeper trenches and wait for Grant's next move. Cold Harbor was a victory, but it was the victory of a slowly dying army. The Confederates could win every battle and still lose the war because they were simply running out of everything: men, food, ammunition, hope. The Battle of Cold Harbor also marked a turning point in how the American public viewed the war. By the summer of 1864, the initial patriotic fervor had long since faded. The casualty lists were incomprehensible. The war that everyone thought would be over in 3 months had dragged on for 3 years. And now, reports from Virginia told of 12,000 men lost in a single morning with nothing to show for it. Northern newspapers, even those that supported the war, began to question Grant's tactics. They started calling him a butcher. They accused him of wasting lives. The Democratic Party, which opposed the war, seized on Cold Harbor as proof that the conflict was unwinnable. They called for a negotiated peace, for letting the South go, for ending the bloodshed before an entire generation was destroyed. Lincoln faced the most difficult political crisis of his presidency. The election of 1864 was coming up in November. If he lost, the new president would almost certainly negotiate a peace that would effectively recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. All the sacrifice, all the deaths, would have been for nothing. Lincoln needed a major victory to turn public opinion around. Cold Harbor was not that victory. For a few dark weeks in June and July of 1864, it looked like the Union might actually lose the war, not on the battlefield, but at the ballot box. What saved Lincoln and the Union was William Tecumseh Sherman. On September 2, 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta. The news electrified the North. After months of grinding, indecisive fighting in Virginia, here was a clear, unambiguous victory. Sherman had broken the back of Confederate resistance in Georgia. He had given the Union something to celebrate. Lincoln won re-election in November. The war would continue. And the sacrifices at Cold Harbor, as terrible as they were, would not be in vain. But for the men who fought at Cold Harbor, for the survivors who had walked into that maelstrom and somehow lived, the battle never really ended. They carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder did not have a name in the 1860s, but the symptoms were the same as they are today. Veterans of Cold Harbor suffered nightmares, flashbacks, and debilitating anxiety. They struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Many turned to alcohol to numb the memories. Some committed suicide. The physical wounds healed, or at least scarred over, but the psychological wounds remained raw. One Union officer, Colonel Horace Porter, later wrote about visiting the Cold Harbor battlefield years after the war. The trenches were still visible, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. He walked the ground where his regiment had charged and tried to calculate how many steps they had taken before the Confederate fire hit them. He counted paces from the Union starting position to where the bodies had been thickest. 87 steps. That is how far they had gotten before they were cut down. 87 steps. Less than 100 yards. That is all the ground they gained for all that blood. The Cold Harbor battlefield today is preserved as part of Richmond National Battlefield Park. You can walk the Confederate trenches. You can stand where the Union soldiers charged from. The distance seems impossibly short. How could anyone survive crossing that ground? How did anyone make it as far as they did? But of course, most of them did not survive. The park is quiet now, peaceful even, covered in grass and trees. But if you know what you are looking for, you can still see the faint depressions in the earth where the trenches ran. You can see the slight rise where the Confederate artillery was positioned. And if you close your eyes and listen, you can almost hear the echoes of that terrible morning in June. The Battle of Cold Harbor represents a fundamental turning point in American military history. It was the moment when the old ways of war finally died. For thousands of years, warfare had been decided by courage, discipline, and the willingness to close with the enemy and fight hand to hand. But the rifle musket, the trench, and the doctrine of defensive firepower had changed that equation. Courage alone was not enough anymore. Discipline could not overcome mathematics. Charging into the teeth of entrenched defenders armed with modern weapons was not bravery. It was suicide. The lessons of Cold Harbor should have been obvious. They should have been studied and absorbed by every military in the world, but they were not. 50 years later, in World War I, European generals would send millions of men across no man's land into machine gun fire and achieve the same results, only on a much larger scale. The trenches of the Western Front were Cold Harbor multiplied by 1,000. The lesson was there for anyone who wanted to see it. Frontal assaults against prepared positions do not work in the age of rifled firearms. But institutional inertia and military tradition are powerful forces. Generals are always prepared to fight the last war. And so, the slaughter continued. For the United States Army, Cold Harbor was a harsh teacher. The army that emerged from the Civil War was fundamentally different from the army that had entered it. The common soldiers had learned to question orders that seemed suicidal. Officers had learned to respect the killing power of defensive positions. And the nation had learned that war was no longer a glorious adventure, but an industrial process of destruction. These lessons would shape American military doctrine for generations. Cold Harbor also highlights the terrible burden of command. Grant made a mistake. He ordered an attack that should not have been ordered. He persisted in a course of action that was clearly failing, and 12,000 men paid the price for his error. But Grant was not a monster. He was a man trying to end a war that had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that aggressive action was the only way to break the deadlock. He was willing to accept enormous casualties in pursuit of strategic victory. History has judged him both a butcher and a military genius. Perhaps he was both. What is undeniable is that the men who charged at Cold Harbor displayed a level of courage that is almost incomprehensible to modern audiences. They knew they were going to die. They wrote their names on their uniforms because they knew their bodies would not be recognizable. And yet, when the order came, they stood up and marched forward. They did their duty even when their duty was to walk into hell. That kind of courage, that kind of sacrifice deserves to be remembered. It deserves to be honored. Even if the battle itself was a mistake, even if the tactics were flawed, the bravery of those men was real. The Union soldiers at Cold Harbor were not professional warriors. They were farmers, shopkeepers, clerks, and laborers. They were citizen soldiers, the backbone of the American military tradition. They had volunteered to preserve the Union, to end slavery, to uphold the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. They did not ask to die in a muddy Virginia field. They did not want to become statistics in a failed assault. But when their country called, they answered. And when their commanders ordered them forward, they went. That is the essence of military service. That is the cost of freedom. In the end, Cold Harbor achieved nothing tactically. No ground was gained. No strategic objectives were met. The Confederate line held. Grant would have to find another way to get to Richmond. But in a larger sense, Cold Harbor was part of the slow, grinding process that eventually wore down the Confederacy. Every battle, even the defeats, brought the Union closer to victory because the Union could replace its losses and the Confederacy could not. Cold Harbor was part of the strategy of exhaustion that eventually forced Lee to surrender at Appomattox. It was a terrible price to pay, but it was a price the Union was willing and able to pay. We should also remember that the Civil War was about something more than military tactics and casualty ratios. It was about the future of the United States. It was about whether a nation conceived in liberty could survive or whether it would tear itself apart. It was about whether 4 million enslaved people would remain in bondage or be freed. The soldiers at Cold Harbor were fighting for that. They may not have thought about it in those terms as they charged across that field, but that is what was at stake. Their sacrifice, however flawed the tactics, was not meaningless. It was part of the larger struggle to preserve the Union and end slavery. 10 months after Cold Harbor, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The Army of Northern Virginia, the finest fighting force the Confederacy ever produced, laid down its arms. The war was over. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished. And the nation began the long, painful process of Reconstruction. None of that would have been possible without the men who fought at places like Cold Harbor. They paid for that victory with their lives. If you have made it this far, you clearly value the deep, often difficult stories that define who we are as Americans. If this story of sacrifice and tragedy resonated with you, please give this video a like. It truly helps these stories reach more people. And do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you do not miss our next deep dive into American military history. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Was Grant right to order the assault at Cold Harbor? Or should he have recognized the futility earlier and called it off? Let the debate begin below. The memory of those 12,000 men deserves to be discussed, debated, and remembered. The Battle of Cold Harbor stands as one of the darkest moments in American military history. It was 8 minutes of horror that exposed the brutal reality of industrial warfare. It was a clash between old tactics and new technology. It was a testament to the courage of the common soldier and a reminder of the terrible cost of command decisions. Above all, it was a moment when the romantic notions of warfare died in the mud and blood of a Virginia field, replaced by the grim understanding that modern war was mechanized slaughter. We remember Cold Harbor not to glorify war but to honor sacrifice. We remember it so that future generations will understand what their ancestors endured. We remember it because those men, with their names pinned to their chests, walked into the fire because they believed in something larger than themselves. They believed in the Union, they believed in freedom, and they were willing to die for it. That is the legacy of Cold Harbor. That is why we tell their story. That is why we must never forget.